Maria Santos had always been told she was too small for combat. At barely 5 feet tall and weighing less than 100 pounds, she looked more like a schoolteacher than a resistance fighter. But in the mountains of her war-torn country, appearances meant nothing when survival was everything. The resistance camp buzzed with nervous energy that cold morning in March. Intelligence reports confirmed that Colonel Ramirez, the brutal military leader responsible for countless civilian deaths, would be traveling through the valley below. This was their chance to strike at the heart of the regime that had terrorized their people for years. Maria watched as the senior fighters gathered around Commander Torres, their weathered faces serious as they discussed the mission. She had been with the group for 8 months, mostly handling communications and medical supplies. Despite proving herself capable time and again, she was never chosen for the dangerous operations. "We need every fighter we can get," Torres announced to the assembled group. "Ramirez travels with heavy security. This won't be easy." Maria stepped forward, her heart pounding. "I want to volunteer." The older fighters exchanged glances. Some shook their heads dismissively. Maria had expected this reaction, but she pressed on. "I know these mountains better than anyone. I grew up in the village below. I know every path, every hiding spot." Torres studied her for a long moment. The commander had seen Maria's dedication, her quick thinking during supply runs, and her unwavering commitment to their cause. Still, combat was different from running messages. "The mission requires precision shooting," Torres said slowly. "Have you ever fired at a human target?" Maria's throat felt dry, but she kept her voice steady. "No, but I'm ready to learn. I'm ready to fight for our people." After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Torres nodded. "Very well. You'll be part of the team." The other fighters began checking their weapons and equipment. Maria's excitement was mixed with terror, as the reality of what she had volunteered for began to sink in. She was finally going to be part of a real mission, but it could very well be her last. Torres approached her with a rifle in his hands. It was an old model, clearly well used, with scratches along the barrel and worn wooden stock. "This is for you," he said, handing her the weapon. Maria took the rifle, surprised by its weight. It felt substantial in her hands, but something seemed off about it. The mechanism felt loose when she worked the bolt, and there was a slight rattle when she moved it. "Is this weapon reliable?" she asked. Torres looked uncomfortable. "It's what we have available. All our good rifles are already assigned to the experienced shooters." Maria understood immediately. She was being given the leftover equipment, the weapon nobody else wanted to trust their life to. It stung, but she refused to let disappointment show on her face. "I understand," she said simply. She spent the rest of the morning familiarizing herself with the rifle, practicing with empty chambers and getting used to its weight and balance. The other fighters prepared their equipment with practiced efficiency, checking ammunition, cleaning their weapons, and studying maps of the area. As afternoon approached, the team began their descent toward the valley. Maria carried her questionable rifle and a small pack of supplies, her mind focused on the mission ahead. She had trained for months in basic marksmanship, but this would be her first real test. The group moved silently through the dense forest, using game trails and hidden paths that Maria knew from her childhood. Every step brought them closer to their target, and closer to a confrontation that would test everything she believed about herself. Despite the uncertainty about her weapon, Maria felt a strange sense of calm settling over her. She had spent her entire life watching others fight for freedom, while she remained on the sidelines. Today, finally, she would have her chance to make a difference. The weight of the rifle in her hands reminded her of its questionable reliability, but she pushed those doubts aside. Somehow she would find a way to contribute to the mission, defective weapon or not. The people counting on them deserved nothing less than her absolute best effort. As evening shadows began to lengthen, the team reached their first checkpoint. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation they had all been preparing for, and Maria knew there would be no turning back. Dawn broke gray and misty over the valley as Maria and her team took their positions along the winding mountain road. The intelligence had been accurate. Colonel Ramirez's convoy would pass through this narrow section where the road curved around a steep cliff face. It was the perfect place for an ambush. Maria found herself assigned to a rocky outcrop about 200 meters from where the convoy would slow down for the sharp turn. Her position offered a clear view of the road, but also left her somewhat isolated from the other fighters. She suspected this wasn't entirely accidental. If her unreliable rifle failed, she would be far enough away not to compromise the main assault. She settled behind a large boulder, using her pack to steady the rifle barrel. The weapon felt even more questionable in the cold morning air. When she worked the bolt, it caught slightly and she had to use more force than seemed normal. A small voice in her head wondered if the rifle would fire at all when the moment came. Through her scope, Maria could see portions of the road stretching into the distance. The other fighters were hidden among the rocks and trees, invisible even to her trained eye. Commander Torres had positioned himself with the rocket launcher that would stop the lead vehicle, while the best marksman covered the rear of the convoy. Hours passed slowly. Maria's muscles began to ache from maintaining her position, but she forced herself to stay alert. Birds sang in the trees around her, and occasionally a small animal would rustle through the underbrush. The peaceful morning seemed at odds with the violence they were preparing to unleash. Around mid-morning, a faint rumble echoed through the valley. Maria's heart rate immediately spiked as she recognized the sound of approaching vehicles. Through her scope, she could see dust rising in the distance where the road disappeared around another bend several kilometers away. "Contact," crackled softly through her radio earpiece. 3 vehicles approaching. The middle one appears to be armored. Maria adjusted her position slightly, checking her rifle one more time. The bolt still felt loose, but there was nothing she could do about it now. She estimated the distance to the road and tried to calculate where she would need to aim, to compensate for any irregularities in the weapon's performance. The rumbling grew louder, and soon Maria could make out individual vehicles through her scope. The convoy consisted of 2 military jeeps flanking an armored personnel carrier. Even from her distance, she could see soldiers manning machine guns on the open vehicles. Her assigned target was the rear jeep. If everything went according to plan, Torres would disable the lead vehicle with his rocket, the main team would assault the armored carrier where Ramirez traveled, and Maria would prevent the rear guard from escaping or calling for reinforcements. The convoy slowed as it approached the sharp curve, just as the intelligence had predicted. Maria could see the soldiers clearly now, young men not much older than herself, following orders from leaders they might not even fully understand. For a brief moment she hesitated, thinking about the lives that would be lost in the next few minutes. Then she remembered the village raids, the families torn apart, the children who had disappeared in the night. Colonel Ramirez and his forces had shown no mercy to innocent civilians. Today the resistance would show them the same consideration they had given to others. "Stand by," Torres's voice whispered through the radio. "On my mark." Maria's finger found the trigger guard, her breathing controlled and steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The rear jeep was now almost perfectly positioned for her shot. She could see the driver clearly and the gunner standing behind him. "Execute, execute, execute," Torres commanded. The valley exploded into chaos. Torres's rocket struck the lead jeep dead center, sending debris and smoke billowing across the road. The armored carrier skidded to a halt, its occupants scrambling to respond to the sudden attack. Automatic weapons fire erupted from both sides as the resistance fighters opened up from their concealed positions. Maria squeezed her trigger, aiming for the rear jeep's driver. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, but the sound was wrong, a dull crack instead of the sharp report she expected. Through her scope, she saw her shot go wide, striking a rock near the road instead of her intended target. The weapon had misfired, just as she had feared. The driver of the rear jeep was still alive, and already the vehicle was beginning to reverse, trying to escape the ambush zone. In seconds, they would be gone, potentially carrying word of the attack to other military units in the area. Maria worked the bolt frantically, trying to chamber another round, but the mechanism jammed completely. The rifle was now completely useless, leaving her watching helplessly as her target began to slip away. Below in the road, the main battle raged on. The resistance fighters were holding their own against Ramirez's guards, but the rear jeep was gaining speed in its retreat. Soon it would be beyond the effective range of the other fighters who were focused on the immediate threat of the colonel's personal security detail. Maria's mind raced. She had been given one job, one crucial responsibility, and her defective weapon had failed her at the worst possible moment. But she refused to accept defeat. Somehow she had to find another way to complete her mission. Maria threw aside the useless rifle and grabbed her pack, her mind already working on alternatives. The rear jeep was still reversing, but the narrow mountain road limited how quickly it could retreat. If she could get to a position further back along the route, she might still intercept them. She knew these mountains like her own heartbeat. There was an old goat path that cut directly up the cliff face, emerging onto the road about half a kilometer behind where the ambush was taking place. It was steep and dangerous, but it would get her there faster than the jeep could reverse along the winding road. Without hesitation, Maria scrambled down from her rocky position and sprinted toward the cliff face. Behind her, the battle continued to rage. She could hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire, the deeper boom of grenades, and shouted commands in both Spanish and the local dialect. Every instinct told her to help her teammates, but she forced herself to focus on her own mission. The goat path was barely visible, worn into the rock by decades of animals seeking the easiest route up the steep incline. Maria had climbed it many times as a child, but never while carrying equipment, and certainly never with bullets flying in the valley below. She clipped her radio to her belt and began climbing, using handholds that were little more than cracks in the stone. Her boots slipped on loose rocks, sending small avalanches cascading down behind her. Every few meters, she paused to catch her breath and check her progress. Through her earpiece, she could hear updates from the battle. "Lead vehicle neutralized," came Torres's voice, strained but professional. "Ramirez's carrier is pinned down but still fighting back." Maria climbed faster, her lungs burning in the thin mountain air. Sweat stung her eyes despite the cool morning temperature. The sound of the reversing jeep grew louder as she ascended. It was moving slowly, the driver probably struggling to navigate the narrow road while looking over his shoulder. Halfway up the cliff, Maria's radio crackled again. "Rear vehicle is escaping the kill zone," reported one of the other fighters. "They're out of our range." She gritted her teeth and pushed harder, grabbing handholds that cut into her palms and finding footholds on ledges barely wide enough for her boots. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had volunteered for this mission to prove herself in combat, and now she was running away from the fight. But this wasn't retreat. This was adaptation. Near the top of the cliff, Maria could hear the jeep's engine growing closer. The vehicle was moving faster now, the driver having gained confidence as the distance from the ambush increased. She had maybe 2 minutes before it would pass the point where the goat path emerged onto the road. Maria hauled herself over the final ledge and found herself standing on the asphalt about 10 meters from where the road curved around another bend. She was breathing hard, her heart pounding from the climb and the adrenaline. The approaching jeep was still out of sight, but she could hear it clearly now. She quickly surveyed her options. Without a functioning rifle, she couldn't engage the vehicle at range. But she did have 2 hand grenades clipped to her belt, standard equipment for all fighters on this mission. The problem was that grenades required close proximity to be effective, and the jeep would be moving too fast for her to get close enough, unless she could stop it first. Maria looked around frantically and spotted a pile of loose rocks near the edge of the road, probably debris from a recent landslide. An idea began forming in her mind, desperate and dangerous, but possibly workable. She ran to the rock pile and began selecting the largest stones she could lift. Working as quickly as possible, she dragged them into the road, creating a barrier that would force the jeep to stop, or at least slow down significantly. It wasn't much, but it might give her the opportunity she needed. The engine noise was very close now. Maria positioned herself behind a large boulder on the uphill side of the road, pulling the pin from one of her grenades, but keeping the safety lever pressed down with her thumb. She would get exactly 1 chance at this. The jeep rounded the bend at high speed, and Maria got her first clear look at her targets. The driver was a young soldier, probably no more than 20, with sweat streaking down his dirt-covered face. Behind him, the gunner was turned around, watching for pursuit from the ambush site. Neither of them had spotted Maria yet. When the driver saw the rock barrier, he slammed on the brakes. The jeep skidded on the loose gravel, fishtailing slightly as it came to a stop just meters from Maria's improvised roadblock. The sudden deceleration threw the gunner off balance, and he had to grab the vehicle's frame to keep from falling out. This was Maria's moment. She released the safety lever on her grenade, counted to 2 to let the fuse burn down, and hurled it toward the stopped vehicle. The small metal sphere arced through the air, trailing a thin wisp of smoke. The driver spotted the incoming grenade and shouted a warning, throwing his door open and diving for cover on the far side of the road. The gunner tried to swing his weapon toward Maria's position, but there wasn't enough time. The explosion shattered the morning quiet, sending metal fragments and debris flying in all directions. The Jeep lurched sideways, one of its tires shredded and its engine smoking. But both soldiers had managed to get clear of the vehicle before the grenade detonated. Now Maria faced a new problem. 2 armed soldiers who knew exactly where she was, and she only had 1 grenade left. Bullets cracked against the boulder protecting Maria as the 2 soldiers recovered from the grenade blast. She pressed herself flat against the rock, feeling chips of stone spray across her back. The gunner had managed to retrieve his rifle from the damaged Jeep and was now firing in controlled bursts, trying to pin her down while his companion maneuvered for a better angle. Maria's radio crackled with urgent transmissions from the main battle. "Heavy resistance from the armored vehicle," Torres reported. "We need more time to finish this." She knew what that meant. If these 2 soldiers escaped, they would radio for reinforcements that could arrive before the resistance fighters could complete their mission and withdraw safely. Everything depended on stopping them here and now. The firing paused momentarily as one of the soldiers reloaded. Maria risked a quick look around the edge of her boulder and saw the driver working his way up the slope on her right, trying to get above her position. The gunner remained behind the wrecked Jeep, ready to resume suppressing fire the moment she showed herself. Maria pulled the pin from her second and final grenade. But this time she didn't throw it immediately. Instead, she called out in Spanish, "You're surrounded. Your colonel is dead. Surrender now and you'll live." It was a bluff, but she hoped the soldiers didn't know that. From their perspective, isolated and cut off from their unit, it might seem plausible that they had walked into a larger trap. "Show yourself," the gunner shouted back. "Prove it." The driver continued his flanking movement, now only about 20 meters away and climbing steadily. In another minute, he would be in position to fire down at Maria from above. She had to act soon. Instead of responding to the gunner's challenge, Maria released the safety lever on her grenade and began counting. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. Then she hurled it in a high arc, not toward the soldiers but toward the road surface between them. The grenade bounced once on the asphalt and exploded in a shower of rock fragments and smoke. Neither soldier was seriously injured, but the blast created a dense cloud of dust and debris that temporarily blinded both of them. Maria used those precious seconds to sprint from her hiding place toward the damaged Jeep. The vehicle's radio equipment was her real target. If she could destroy it, the soldiers wouldn't be able to call for help even if they survived the encounter. She reached the Jeep just as the dust began to clear. The radio was mounted behind the driver's seat, its antenna still intact despite the grenade damage. Maria grabbed a large rock from the roadside and began smashing the radio equipment, destroying the control panel and severing the antenna cable. "Stop right there." The gunner emerged from the dust cloud, his rifle trained on Maria's center mass. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead, but his hands were steady. Maria froze, the rock still in her hands. She was completely exposed, with no cover between herself and the soldier's weapon. At this range, he couldn't possibly miss. But before the gunner could fire, a new sound echoed through the valley, the distinctive whistle of an incoming mortar round. Both Maria and the soldier looked up instinctively, trying to locate the source of the sound. The round impacted about 50 meters away, showering the area with dirt and fragments. It was followed immediately by 2 more explosions, each one closer than the last. Someone was providing artillery support, but Maria couldn't tell if it was friendly or enemy fire. In the confusion, the driver called out from his position on the slope. "We need to get out of here. The whole area is compromised." The gunner's attention wavered for just an instant as he processed this new threat. Maria didn't waste the opportunity. She hurled the rock in her hands directly at his face, causing him to flinch and pull his shot wide. Then she dove behind the Jeep's engine block, the heaviest cover available. More mortar rounds began falling around them, creating a deadly rain of hot metal and stone. Maria realized that these weren't supporting fires. They were preparatory rounds for a larger military response. The escaped soldiers must have already radioed their position before she destroyed their equipment. Through the smoke and noise, she could hear both soldiers shouting to each other, trying to coordinate their withdrawal. They were professional fighters, and they recognized that the tactical situation had shifted against them. Their best option now was to escape on foot and link up with the reinforcements that were obviously en route. But Maria couldn't let that happen. If these men provided intelligence about the resistance fighters' positions and numbers, it would compromise future operations and endanger her comrades still fighting in the valley below. She checked her remaining equipment. No grenades, no functioning rifle, just her sidearm with 2 full magazines and a combat knife. Against 2 experienced soldiers with assault rifles, those weapons seemed pitifully inadequate. The mortar fire was getting closer, forcing all 3 combatants to take cover. But Maria noticed something the soldiers hadn't. The pattern of impact suggested the artillery was coming from the same direction as the main road, which meant the reinforcements were shelling their own escape route. This gave her an idea. If she could force the soldiers to move toward the incoming fire, they might become victims of their own support. It was risky, but everything about this mission had been risky from the beginning. Maria began moving along the road, using the damaged jeep and scattered boulders as cover. She needed to get between the soldiers and their best escape route, forcing them to choose between facing her or facing their own artillery. The mortar bombardment intensified, sending massive explosions rippling across the mountainside. Maria used the chaos to advance position by position, moving from one piece of cover to the next. Each blast showered her with debris, but also masked the sound of her movement from the 2 soldiers. Through the smoke and dust, she caught glimpses of her targets. The driver had descended from his elevated position and was now moving parallel to the road, staying low and using the terrain for concealment. The gunner remained near the wrecked jeep, but he was preparing to withdraw. Maria could see him gathering equipment and checking his ammunition. Her radio crackled through the noise. "Primary target eliminated," came Torres's voice, barely audible over the explosions. "Ramirez is down. Beginning withdrawal to secondary positions." Relief flooded through Maria. The main mission had succeeded. Colonel Ramirez would never terrorize another village. But her own fight was far from over. The approaching reinforcements would bring fresh troops and heavy weapons. If she didn't neutralize these 2 soldiers quickly, they could still provide crucial intelligence about the resistance fighters' escape routes. A mortar round landed uncomfortably close, the blast wave knocking Maria to her knees and filling her ears with ringing. When her vision cleared, she saw that the gunner had used the distraction to sprint away from the jeep, moving toward a cluster of large rocks that would provide better protection from the artillery. But his movement had also brought him closer to Maria's position. She estimated the distance at maybe 40 meters, still a difficult shot with her sidearm, but within the realm of possibility if she could get a clear firing position. Maria worked her way around a boulder and found herself with a partial view of the gunner's new hiding spot. She could see his shoulder and part of his rifle barrel protruding from behind the rocks. It wasn't much of a target, but it was something. She drew her pistol and steadied it against the boulder, taking careful aim. The artillery noise would mask the sound of her shot, giving her the element of surprise for at least 1 round. But at this distance, with limited target area visible, she would need to make that first shot count. Before she could fire, movement caught her eye. The driver was flanking around to her left, moving quickly between shell craters and staying low to avoid both the shrapnel and Maria's potential line of fire. He was obviously trying to get behind her position. Maria found herself caught between 2 threats, the gunner pinned down ahead of her, and the driver maneuvering for position on her flank. If she focused on one, the other would be free to act. If she tried to engage both, she probably wouldn't succeed against either. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. More concerning, the artillery was beginning to shift its target area, moving closer to the ambush site in the valley below. That meant the reinforcements had identified the general location of the resistance fighters and were trying to cut off their escape routes. Maria's teammates were in serious danger, and there was nothing she could do to help them, while these 2 soldiers remained a threat. Every minute she spent pinned down here was a minute closer to disaster for the entire resistance cell. She made a decision that went against every tactical principle she had learned. Instead of staying in cover and trying to outmaneuver her opponents, Maria stood up and began walking directly toward the gunner's position, her pistol held ready but not immediately threatening. "I'm coming to talk," she called out in Spanish, loudly enough to be heard over the artillery. "We can end this without more killing." It was an insane gamble. Both soldiers could easily gun her down before she got close enough to engage effectively. But Maria was counting on their training and professionalism. Soldiers were taught to accept surrenders and negotiate when possible, especially when the tactical situation was unclear. The gunner rose slightly from his cover, his rifle trained on Maria, but his finger outside the trigger guard. "Stop where you are," he commanded. "Drop your weapon." Maria continued walking but didn't lower her pistol. "Your colonel is dead," she said, projecting her voice over the noise. "Your backup is shelling your own position. You're cut off and outnumbered, but you're soldiers, not murderers. We can work something out." She could see uncertainty in the gunner's eyes. He was young, probably conscripted rather than a volunteer, and the reality of his situation was beginning to sink in. His radio was destroyed, his vehicle was disabled, and artillery was falling all around them. Even if he killed Maria, his chances of survival were minimal. But the driver was different. Maria could sense him moving on her flank, positioning himself for a clear shot. Unlike the gunner, he seemed more experienced, more committed to completing his mission regardless of the cost. Maria was now within 30 meters of the gunner, close enough to see the sweat on his face and the tremor in his hands. She could also sense the driver's presence behind her, probably lining up his shot. In seconds, this tense standoff would explode into violence. "Think about your family," Maria said to the gunner, her voice steady despite the mortar rounds still falling around them. "Think about going home alive. Your war is over. Colonel Ramirez can't give you orders anymore." The gunner's rifle barrel wavered slightly. For a moment, Maria thought he might actually lower his weapon. Then the driver opened fire from behind her. The bullet meant for Maria's back went wide as she threw herself sideways, her instincts saving her life in the split second before the driver's rifle cracked behind her. She hit the ground hard, rolling behind a low ridge of rock as more shots followed, chips of stone exploding around her position. The gunner in front of her had ducked back into cover when the shooting started, but now he was caught in an impossible position. If he emerged to fire at Maria, he would be exposed to the artillery that continued to rain down around them. If he stayed hidden, she might be able to close the distance and eliminate him at point-blank range. Maria's mind raced through her options as bullets snapped overhead. The driver was approximately 15 meters behind her, and to the left using a shell crater for cover. The gunner was 20 meters ahead, protected by a cluster of boulders. She was pinned between them with limited cover and nowhere to run. But the artillery bombardment was creating opportunities as well as dangers. Each explosion sent up clouds of dust and smoke that could mask her movement. The noise was so intense that the soldiers would have difficulty coordinating with each other, and the constant threat of incoming rounds would force them to divide their attention between her and the shells falling around them. A mortar round landed close enough to shower Maria with dirt and fragments. As the dust cloud expanded, she made her move. Instead of retreating or advancing, she scrambled laterally along the ridge, moving toward a position where she could engage both soldiers from their flank. The movement was exhausting and terrifying. Every few meters, she had to freeze and press herself flat as bullets searched for her through the dust. Her uniform was torn in several places, and blood seeped from cuts where sharp rocks had scraped against her skin, but she was making progress. Through a gap in the smoke, Maria caught sight of the driver reloading his rifle. He was perhaps 12 meters away now, close enough that even her pistol would be devastatingly effective, but he was also alert and experienced, his eyes constantly scanning for threats while his hands worked automatically to chamber fresh ammunition. Maria waited until another artillery blast obscured the area, then rose into a shooting position. The driver spotted her movement and tried to bring his rifle to bear, but he was only halfway through his reload cycle. For a brief moment, both fighters were aiming at each other with weapons that weren't quite ready to fire. Maria's pistol was already loaded and cocked. She had the advantage, but only for a fraction of a second. She squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession, both rounds striking the driver's center mass. He fell backward into his crater, his rifle clattering against the rocks. The gunner heard the shots and realized that his partner was down. Maria could hear him moving among the boulders, probably trying to get a better angle on her position. She had eliminated one threat, but the remaining soldier was now fully committed to the fight with nothing left to lose. "Surrender now," Maria called out, though she knew it was useless. The time for negotiation had passed when the shooting started. This would end with one of them dead. The artillery barrage was beginning to slacken, which meant the reinforcements were probably preparing to advance on foot. Maria estimated she had maybe 10 minutes before fresh troops arrived in the area. If she couldn't finish this quickly, she would find herself facing an entire squad instead of a single soldier. She began working her way toward the gunner's position, using every piece of available cover. Her approach was methodical but quick, closing the distance by bounds between artillery impacts. Each movement brought her closer to ending this deadly game of hide-and-seek. At 8 meters from the boulder cluster, Maria paused to assess the situation. She could hear the gunner moving around but couldn't pinpoint his exact location. The rocks provided multiple hiding spots and firing positions, giving him several options for engaging her when she made her final advance. Maria pulled out her combat knife and held it in her left hand while keeping her pistol ready in her right. At close quarters, the knife might be faster than trying to aim and fire, especially if the soldier tried to rush her position. She took a deep breath and prepared for the final confrontation. Over the past few hours, she had been forced to adapt repeatedly, dealing with a defective rifle, climbing a cliff face, improvising with grenades, and now hunting experienced soldiers through an artillery bombardment. Each challenge had pushed her beyond what she thought she was capable of, but now, crouched behind a rock with weapons in both hands and death only meters away, Maria felt a strange calm settling over her. All the preparation, all the training, all the fear and uncertainty had led to this moment. She was no longer the small woman who had been given the worst rifle and assigned to the safest position. She had become something harder, more dangerous. The gunner's rifle barrel appeared around the edge of a boulder, searching for targets. Maria could see his shadow moving behind the rocks, but couldn't get a clear shot without exposing herself to return fire. Then she heard something that made her blood run cold. The distant sound of approaching helicopters. The reinforcements weren't coming on foot. They were coming by air, which meant they would arrive much sooner than she had calculated. The final confrontation couldn't wait any longer. The helicopter rotors grew louder with each passing second, their rhythmic thumping echoing off the mountain walls. Maria knew she had minutes, maybe less, before the aircraft arrived with fresh troops and heavy weapons. The final soldier had to be eliminated now, or everything her team had accomplished would be for nothing. She studied the boulder cluster where the gunner was hiding, looking for any weakness in his position. The rocks formed a rough circle with several gaps between them, but each opening was covered by at least one other position. He had chosen his hiding spot well. Any direct assault would expose her to accurate rifle fire at close range. But Maria noticed something the soldier probably hadn't considered. One of the boulders was perched precariously on a slope, held in place by smaller rocks and packed earth. The recent artillery bombardment had loosened the soil around its base, and a few well-placed impacts might be enough to shift it. Maria holstered her pistol and began gathering small rocks, each one about the size of her fist. It was a desperate plan, but desperate situations called for creative solutions. If she could destabilize the boulder, it might crush the gunner or at least force him out of his protected position. She began throwing rocks at the boulder's base, aiming for the spots where the supporting stones looked weakest. The first few impacts had little effect, but gradually she began to see movement. Dirt and pebbles started trickling down the slope as the massive stone shifted slightly. The gunner heard the rocks striking above him and realized what Maria was attempting. He emerged from cover with his rifle raised, trying to stop her before she could bring the boulder down on top of him. But his movement exposed him to Maria's return fire. She drew her pistol in one fluid motion and fired 3 quick shots. The first missed, sparking off the rocks beside the gunner's head. The second caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing his rifle to discharge harmlessly into the air. The third shot struck him center mass and he collapsed behind the boulders. Maria didn't wait to confirm the kill. The helicopters were almost overhead now, and she could see the dark shapes of aircraft through the smoke and dust. She had perhaps 2 minutes to escape before the area would be swarming with reinforcements. She grabbed her radio and keyed the transmission. "Overwatch position secure," she reported, using the code phrase that meant her mission was complete. "All targets neutralized. Beginning withdrawal." Torres's voice crackled back immediately. "Copy that, Overwatch. Well done. Proceed to Rally Point Beta. We'll meet you there." Maria took one last look at the carnage around her. The destroyed jeep, the shell craters, the bodies of the soldiers she had been forced to kill. There was no satisfaction in the violence, only grim necessity. These men had chosen to serve a brutal regime, but they were still human beings who would never see their families again. But then she thought about the villages that Colonel Ramirez would never raid again. The children who would grow up free because of what the resistance had accomplished today. Sometimes the price of freedom was measured in blood, and today she had been willing to pay that price. Maria shouldered her pack and began jogging toward the rally point, staying low and using the terrain for concealment. Behind her, the first helicopter was landing near the ambush site, disgorging soldiers who would find only destruction and empty positions. The resistance fighters had vanished into the mountains like ghosts, leaving their enemies to count the cost of underestimating them. As she ran through the familiar mountain paths, Maria reflected on how much had changed since morning. She had volunteered for this mission to prove herself worthy of inclusion in the Resistance's combat operations. The defective rifle she had been given was supposed to be a sign that she wasn't trusted with the important tasks. Instead, that useless weapon had forced her to find other ways to contribute. When conventional tactics failed, she had improvised. When equipment let her down, she had relied on her knowledge of the terrain and her determination to complete the mission. Most importantly, when faced with experienced soldiers who should have outmatched her in every way, she had found the will to do whatever was necessary to protect her comrades. The rally point was a hidden cave system about 3 kilometers from the ambush site. Maria arrived to find most of her teammates already there, treating wounds and conducting equipment checks. They looked up as she entered, and she saw new respect in their eyes. Commander Torres approached her with a slight smile. "I heard your radio reports. Sounds like you had quite an adventure up there." Maria nodded, suddenly feeling the exhaustion that adrenaline had been holding at bay. "The rifle you gave me jammed after the first shot." "I had to improvise." Torres's expression grew serious. "I owe you an apology for that weapon. It was all we had available, but I should have found you something more reliable." "Actually," Maria said, surprising herself with the realization, "I think it worked out for the best. If I had stayed in my original position with a working rifle, those soldiers would have escaped." Sometimes the best plans are the ones you have to make up as you go along. The other fighters gathered around as Maria recounted her experience. The climb up the cliff face, the improvised roadblock, the final confrontation among the boulders. They listened with the attention soldiers reserve for combat stories that might save their lives someday. When she finished, one of the older fighters shook his head in amazement. "You took out 2 experienced soldiers and destroyed their radio with nothing but grenades and a pistol? That's either incredible skill or incredible luck." "Probably both," Maria admitted. "But mostly it was knowing that failure wasn't an option. Too many people were counting on us to succeed." Torres stood up and addressed the group. "Today we proved that the regime's grip on our country is not as strong as they want us to believe. Colonel Ramirez thought he was untouchable, but we showed him otherwise. And we showed ourselves that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they're fighting for something worth dying for." As the resistance fighters prepared to move deeper into the mountains, Maria cleaned her pistol and checked her remaining equipment. The defective rifle lay abandoned somewhere on the mountainside, but she no longer saw it as a symbol of distrust or inadequacy. Instead, it had become proof that the weapon doesn't make the warrior. Courage, determination, and the willingness to adapt in the face of adversity do. The helicopters were still searching the valley below, their searchlights cutting through the gathering darkness. But the resistance fighters were already moving through hidden trails that would take them far from the scene of their victory. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new missions. But tonight they could rest knowing that they had struck a significant blow against tyranny. Maria Santos had entered the day as the smallest member of the team. Given the worst equipment and assigned to the safest position, she ended it as a proven fighter who had accomplished her mission against impossible odds. The useless gun they had handed her had become irrelevant the moment she decided that failure was not an option. In the mountains of her war-torn country, appearances still meant nothing when survival was everything. But now Maria knew that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about being willing to risk everything for the chance to build something better.